Good afternoon. It's an honor to be able to address each of you, even if only in a virtual environment, especially as we celebrate the month of the military family. I would like to thank each of you that have served, whether active, reserve, or on the home front. In the military, we learn that family is much more than blood. Our comrades and friends we meet along the journey that will support us and those we have to leave while deployed truly become part of the extended family. As DLA Disposition Services supports the warfighter, we too play a role in that extended family. So thank you to each and every one of you. This month is set aside as a time to acknowledge the tremendous sacrifices our military families make. Just as most of us use the month to reflect all the things we are grateful for over the past year and to remember those we have lost as we approach the holiday season. Our military families are doing the same. Recently, we had the opportunity to hear from the director of Michigan's Veteran Affairs Agency during the Veterans Day virtual program. She spoke on many resources available to our military families, past and present. But she also spoke on some of her own struggles, especially with suicide. If you haven't had a chance to view the program, I highly encourage you to go back and watch it. Today, I have the honor of introducing to you our guest speaker, Mr. Scott Tishman. He is the Suicide Prevention Facilitator for Summit Point and the Suicide Prevention Coalition of Calhoun County. Scott is a QPR, which stands for Question, Persuade, and Refer instructor, and master trainer with over a decade of experience in behavioral health care, including intensive case management, mobile crisis response, and psychological first aid. For those not familiar with QRP, it teaches life-saving skills, and it is the most widely taught gatekeeper training in the world. Just as CPR prepares you for stepping in to assist with a cardiac emergency, QPR teaches the skills and knowledge to intervene to prevent suicide. Scott is also a suicide attempt survivor, and in 2018 started the Suicide Attempt Survivors Support Group, the first peer support group of its kind in Michigan. He is currently working on a new project, Speak the Unspeakable, which is a video series focused on suicide prevention through the lens of lived experience. Scott lives with his wife in Michigan, where he enjoys mountain biking, disc golf, kayaking, and playing a variety of musical instruments. However, before I turn it over to Scott to hear his story and message, I would like to remind you of a few housekeeping items. It is important that everyone on government Zoom to sign in using your name and the gal. If you're on the phone only, please email mwr.battlecreek@dla.mil from your work email. We will use this to record your attendance. At the end of this presentation, we'll also provide a survey in the chat feature for those online and via email for those on the phone. Please take a moment to let us know your thoughts about the program. Now, without any further ado, now that we've got all of this out of the way, please join me in welcoming Mr. Scott Tishman.
Hello, and thank you for that warm greeting and introduction. I think the topic of family is going to resonate with what the message I'll be sharing with you. Just get my screen shared. So thank you for joining me today, or to speak more collectively, thank you for joining us. Whether you're viewing this or hearing this from your home or from your office, let's take a second to imagine all of the other people who are joining us together in this moment. Now, over the next hour, we'll be collectively focusing our time, our energy, and our thoughts on a crucially important subject. The title of this presentation is Speak the Unspeakable, building hope, connectedness, and resilience through our words. However, the overarching message that I will be sharing with you is that of survival, of resilience, perseverance, flexibility, adaptability, determination, patience, and courage. We often think of these things in terms of individual characteristics, as if we carry around a limited or set amount of each. Some people may possess more of a particular characteristic and some less, but I think this is a grave misrepresentation. This doesn't tell us the whole truth. I would argue that just as with hope, with connectedness, and with resilience, these are not just individually held traits that we possess. These are characteristics that we build together, that we possess together. Again, with that theme of family, of community. Hope. Hope can be defined as the expectation that one will have a positive experiences or that a potentially negative situation will ultimately result in a favorable state of affairs. This is an outlook. It's a perspective. Connectedness is the sense of belonging to a group, community, or family, and of being cared for, valued, and supported. Resilience can be defined as the process of successfully adapting to difficult or challenging life experiences, especially through mental, emotional, and behavioral flexibility. And when I talk about resilience, I think what I'd really focus on is our resilience as human beings, which in many ways we could look at ourselves as the most adaptable species on this planet. We have inherent resilience within us. And we all have a story. So take a moment, think about your story. Think about the narratives that you tell yourself. It is in our narratives that we tell ourselves who we are and how we fit in this world. Our learned constructs provide the building blocks for these narratives, but what shapes and what defines these concepts and constructs through which we view the world, through which we view ourselves? The neural networks of our brains are shaped through experience. And as we develop our early concepts in infancy, we continue to refine, we continue to create new concepts throughout the lifespan. Symbolic language gives us the unique ability to combine and create increasingly abstract concepts and the ability to communicate those concepts and to work collaboratively with others, which is a huge part of what makes humanity just so remarkably adaptable to a wide variety of environments. Because of this, we can potentially come up with infinite solutions to any given problem. But this conceptual ability can also have its costs. It can lead us to concepts, it can lead us to solutions that might not be useful. And some that might ultimately be maladaptive, such as the concept of suicide. I would like to share with you my story. More specifically, my story about the tattoo I paid for, but never got. Now, some of you might be familiar with the semicolon tattoo. The symbolism of the tattoo is grammatical in nature. A semicolon represents a sentence that the author could have ended, but chose not to. This started with Project Semicolon in around 2013 with that concept in mind, and has spread further and further and has become a pretty common, very meaningful tattoo for people across the world. Originally, the semicolon tattoo was designed to represent and bring light issues of suicide, of mental illness, depression, self-harming, self-injurious behavior, and addiction. So I happen to have purchased a rain check for a semicolon tattoo at an event, but I've still yet to cash in on that. There are a number of reasons for that, but I'd like to share a little bit more context with you. For the majority of the last 25 years, I have thought about suicide nearly every single day. I think about suicide, I read about suicide, I consume media about suicide, including TV and film. For a long time, I had such an intense focus on suicide because a part of me wanted to die. A part of me did not believe that I belonged in this world. Now, thankfully, the last 10 years of my intense focus on suicide has revolved around wanting to help others. You see, I have come through the other side. I tried to end my life 16 years ago. Thankfully, a first responder saved me after someone must have noticed something was wrong. I still haven't thanked them. For many years, I've wanted to, but the lingering shame has always stopped me. Beginning from an early age, shame, self-hatred, anxiety, and fear have tainted much of my life. Our thoughts, our feelings, our perceptions are meant to help protect us. They're meant to help guide us through life, but they can also deceive us, mislead us, and convince us that life is not worth living, that we are not worth loving, and that our pain will never end. Mental illness. Growing up, most people thought I was just shy. I thought I was subhuman. And while I thought that most people were good, I knew that I was bad. I constantly ruminated on my worthlessness and my failings and lived in fear each day that others would find out the truth about me. Years and years of treatment-resistant depression left me hopeless, and I frequently lacked the necessary coping skills to deal with life's inevitable pains, its heartaches, its disappointments, let alone grapple with that unremitting shame that always lurked beneath the surface. Suicide was my escape plan. Healing came slowly, self-acceptance, self-compassion came slowly. And in fact, it's taken decades and is still a work in progress. But I now understand that thoughts are just thoughts. Feelings are just feelings. They are ultimately fleeting, and I no longer have to allow them to control me, nor define me, nor diminish my value as a human being. I may still experience thoughts of suicide, but they no longer bring me to the depths of despair and hopelessness that they used to. They now serve as the warning signs, alerting me that something's wrong, that some kind of change is needed, sometimes mentally, sometimes physiologically, sometimes environmentally. I still have backup plans, escape plans for life, if it ever becomes unbearable again, but suicide's not one of them. I was born in Ashtabula, Ohio, born into a family of four. You can see my parents, Sandy and Ron, and my older brother, Sean. At the age of 8, my family moved to Michigan, which is where I graduated from high school in Whitehall, Michigan. And from an early age, I had a sense of perfectionism, that everything had to be a certain way, that everything had to be right. But along with that, a sense that I could never quite get it right enough. So I had frequent negative self-evaluation. And with this, I had the sense that something was wrong with me. And again, going back to just this sense, this feeling, and it was not rational, but just that I was bad, that I was subhuman. This shame, it eroded my sense of belonging at school, and it made me feel unwanted and unloved at home. These were cognitive distortions. By age 11, my everyday experiences were marred by the constant fear that others would find out the truth about me. I also developed paranoia that others were conspiring against me. And I began to perceive normal acts of kindness as either pity or as a plot that would later lead to my deserved public humiliation. Social anxiety led to further and further isolation, which eventually became noticeable to my parents. In middle school, they had me see multiple therapists, and I was eventually put on antidepressants. By 9th grade, I began having thoughts of suicide. The constant internal theme that I didn't belong in society had evolved into thoughts that I didn't belong on this earth. In addition to escaping and avoiding the future psychological pain and fear of my everyday existence, suicidal thoughts gave me the sense that if I killed myself, maybe people, those around me, would finally understand what I was going through. These suicidal thoughts became more persistent, as they served to reduce my distress by giving me a sense of control, a way to end my pain, and a way to feel understood. It was a self-discovered coping strategy, albeit a maladaptive one, and it was self-reinforcing. It was also a secret that I carried around with me every day. And it was a secret to which no one thought to ask. Not my parents, not my teachers, not even my behavioral health providers, my counselor, my therapist. From the outside, I appeared to be successful, a multi-sport athlete, a musician, a member of the National Honor Society who graduated first in his class, with a full ride scholarship to a four-year university. The only outward indications or clues that I was struggling might have been my extreme shyness, the fact that I missed a lot of school. In fact, I missed enough days one year that I had to present to a school committee regarding my attendance in order to even pass. Otherwise, they would hold me back. And the other sign might have been that I quit basketball in my 10th grade year, which had been a huge passion of mine for a very long time. I eventually carried this shame and these secret thoughts of suicide with me to college, where my life really turned upside down. On top of the pressures of school, and along with my persistent depression and social anxiety, I was also navigating the worlds of girlfriends, of heartbreak, of jealousy, as well as coping with my father's cancer diagnosis and his eventual death 6 months later. After his death, I took a semester off, but I was never able to regain and maintain momentum in college. My 4-year degree, a bachelor's of science in psychology, took me 7 years as I withdrew from the university nearly every other semester. My doctors had me on a laundry list of medications, trying one combination after the other. Some had terrible side effects, some even exacerbated my depressive symptoms, but nothing seemed to work. They eventually gave me the label of treatment-resistant depression, which furthered my hopelessness. I went on and off my meds, sometimes experiencing horrible withdrawal symptoms. I had night terrors and life became a living hell. Some of my medication lapses were because I simply couldn't pick up my refills due to social anxiety. The end result, however, of that withdrawal, of the downward spiral, was the same, but I did not have the insight to connect the dots. One night, following one of the many semesters where I withdrew from college, and I had just applied for a couple jobs, I was home alone in my mother's house with our family dog. She was out of town for the week as she worked out of town. And I had the thought, with having applied for those jobs, with being off of school again, I had the thought, why start something new? If you're going to kill yourself, you may as well do it now. And that was enough to set the rest in motion. I improvised my suicide method without any prior planning. It was as though I was driven by a machine. I had to do this. There was almost no deliberation. I had set off with the intent to end my life on a number of prior occasions before that, but I was always able to stop myself. But this time was different. This time I wouldn't let myself back out. As I moved towards bringing about my own death, I knew that I didn't want my mother to be the one to find me. So I went to what I thought would be a secluded place around 3 a.m. Thankfully, I was wrong. So for today's message, speak the unspeakable. This is the concept that I would like to focus on together. So why speak the unspeakable? We'll tackle the questions, who defines what's unspeakable? And I also want to address the paradoxical nature of speak the unspeakable. Now, what do I mean by unspeakable? We might experience unspeakable shame, guilt, unspeakable hopelessness, pain, loss, trauma, fear, anger, humiliation, or moral injury. But who defines what is unspeakable? Again, going back to the constructs, the concepts that we develop from early in life and continue to refine, continue to build on new concepts. But our culture, right? Largely our culture defines it. It could be our family culture, societal culture, the groups, the organizations we belong to, the schools we go to, the places we work, what's okay to talk about and what's not. Now, there is a paradoxical nature to speak the unspeakable, and I want to address that. So the idea that we might have unspeakable pain, if it's unspeakable, how can we get to the point where it no longer is? And my thought around that is what's been unspeakable in the past, whether it's due to that way because a subject is taboo, because it's something we don't talk about, does not mean that it has to continue to be unspeakable in the present. And the things we might be dealing with, the pain we might be going through now, those things do not need to remain unspeakable in the future. And that applies not just to ourselves individually, that applies to those around us as well, our families, our communities, our society. So when speaking the unspeakable, I'm going to talk about stories that need to be told. And in telling these stories, give us the sense of understanding, that we might be understood. I mentioned for a long time, even when I worked in behavioral health, my depression, my suicide attempt, my suicidal thoughts, it was a secret, and it was a shameful secret that I didn't dare tell others out of fear of rejection, fear of judgment, fear that others might question my competence, they might view me as unsafe, all of the many things that we tag onto this concept of suicide or the concept of mental illness. And with that shame that kept me silent, that just furthered my shame. So by speaking the unspeakable, when we share our stories, that enables us to break out of that. It stops it from becoming this shameful secret and allows us to express ourselves, to be fully ourselves and accept ourselves. I think we also need to understand behavior as communication. I spent a good deal of time working with individuals, working with adults with some of them with developmental disabilities, some of them with communication barriers. And very often behavior was the form of communication. But if we look at ourselves, we all use behavior as communication. What are those behaviors trying to tell others? What are they trying to tell ourselves? What are we trying to communicate? And in some of those behaviors might be reckless behaviors, substance use, could be aggression, outward expressions of physical anger, violence, or it could be directed inward. It could be suicidal behaviors, suicidal thoughts, self-injurious behavior. All of those things might be the ways that we try to communicate the unspeakable. So again, going back to being able to speak the unspeakable rather than keeping it inside and having that develop into negative outcomes. I also want to think of speaking the unspeakable in the stories that we need to tell as viewing it as self-expression as a human need and a human right. I mean, we can even go back to the concept of our Constitution, the freedom of speech, the idea that we have unalienable rights, self-expression, being able to speak our mind is primary as one of our needs. And what is the opposite of that if we don't express ourselves? Repression, which again can lead to those negative outcomes, which for me led to trying to take my own life. I also want to talk about not just the stories that need to be told, but the stories that need to be heard. And when we hear stories, it can give us a sense of belonging. So one important aspect of this is changing the narrative. When we have subjects like suicide that we don't talk about, it's taboo to talk about. When we don't talk about it in society, what happens with that silence and that void is misinformation, misconceptions, and myths that we build around a complete misunderstanding of the nature of suicide because we don't talk about it. And then in our culture, the only time we do talk about it is usually after somebody has died by suicide. And that's usually the only perspective that we get. So the fact is, it's estimated, at least in the United States, that for every one person that dies by suicide, there are around 30 attempts. And the vast majority of people who survive a suicide attempt do not go on to die by suicide at a later time, but go on to lead meaningful lives. But when do we hear those stories, right? All we hear about are the people that died, and that gives us a distorted view. It gives us a distorted perception of suicide. And even if not even just looking at attempts, if we looked at the total population that experienced thoughts of suicide at some time, the vast majority of those survive those thoughts. We need those stories to be told because, again, In that vacuum of silence is where we get misinformation, misperceptions, and the myths around suicide. The reason I started telling my story is with that thought in mind. With those who have lived, who have survived through suicidal crises, by sharing their stories, and evidence is backing this up, by sharing those stories creates a preventative effect, a protective effect, because we can talk about our coping mechanisms, our coping skills. We can talk about how we sought help, how others helped us. But if we go back to the culture where we don't talk about suicide, and the only time we do is after a death, all that does is it creates a narrative of despair, a narrative of death. The other reason it's important to speak to people for those stories that need to be heard is because of the power of our words. Even just thinking about the language we usually use about suicide. I'm sure you're all familiar with the phrase committed suicide. We hear that time and time again, committed suicide. Think about the other things that we phrase in that way. What else do we commit? Think about that. In a legal realm, we commit crimes. In a religious realm, we commit sins. So we say committed suicide. And if we think about that and the negative slant that that gives, and that's part of that is based on suicide previously being illegal, right? So in certain cultures, they thought, well, if we make this illegal, that will prevent suicide or reduce suicide. What we know is that really, once we view it that way, we just start, when we get to the subject of suicide, if somebody is expressing suicidal thoughts or suicidal behavior, by using that word committed, it gives us this inclination to judge, right? And judge guilt on that person. So we need to think about the words we use. We also use phrases like a successful attempt, a failed attempt. I don't describe my suicide attempt as a failed attempt. I'm grateful to be alive. When we use these value-laden terms, so successful, is that how we define success? I don't think any of us would define it in such a way. So again, when we talk about language, we need to be clear and we need to think about the nuances. I think keep it simple is the stance I would take. If we're talking about suicide, keep it as simple as possible. If somebody's died by suicide, we say they died by suicide or death by suicide. If somebody attempted suicide and survived, all we need to say is a suicide attempt. We don't need to say committed. We don't need to say failed. We don't need to say successful. And even it's been more popular since we turned away from saying committed for people to say completed suicide. But even that, I would say, is unnecessary, because when we say somebody's completed suicide, it makes me think of, well, then what is an incomplete suicide? Is that me? Is that my suicide attempt? Was that incomplete? And then what does that imply? Does that mean people might just be waiting for me to finish the job? So the power of our words, the words we choose to use, makes a difference. It changes the way we think about life, changes the way we think about topics, including topics of suicide. And again, going back to stories that need to be heard, the human connection. So not only is it important as a human right for self-expression, when I hear somebody else sharing their story, and I can relate to that, I've had similar experiences, and maybe I carry around shame. When I hear somebody else sharing their story, I feel less ashamed. So going back to that cycle of shame and silence, we can break that. And by hearing stories, I can create that human connection. But when I hear your story, when I hear you talk about what you've lived through, how you've survived, I feel less alone. So it's important that we have the stories that we need to tell. It's also important that we have the stories that we need to hear. I teach a training that was already mentioned in the introduction called QPR. It stands for Question, Persuade, Refer. It is a suicide prevention training. And I'm an instructor and a master trainer. And when I do this training, and I'll talk more about QPR in a little bit, but when I do this training, I ask the class a specific question. I'm going to ask you the same question. And this might sound like a rhetorical question, but I want you to actually think of an answer for yourself right now. So going back to that 3-step process, question, persuade, refer. For that first step question, after we ask someone a question, what's our next job? Just think to yourself, what is our next job? After we ask a question, what is our next job? It's to listen. So empathic listening. If we want to prevent suicide, if we want people to feel less alone, if we want people to feel connected, if we want to build resilience, one of the best things we can do is to practice empathic listening. So again, not going to just asking the question and listening. Empathic listening is a specific form of active listening, which I'm sure you're familiar with the idea of active listening, and maybe saying back to reflective listening, saying back to somebody what they're saying to us, which is a really good way to portray that we're listening to them, right? Through that reflective listening. It's also a really good way to portray empathy. So if there's a skill that can help people feel seen, to help people feel understood, to feel less alone, to feel less ashamed, if we listen with empathy and without judgment, that is one of the best things that we can do. I want to share with you the one statement that saved my life. And this is probably one of the most impactful interactions that I've had in my life. It was after my suicide attempt. So when I attempted suicide, like I said, I was thankfully rescued by first responders. They brought me to the emergency room. Eventually, I ended up on a hospital inpatient unit. And there were some negative things that happened while I was there, but I want to focus on what was helpful. And again, one of the most impactful things that happened was a very simple interaction. I was sitting around on the perimeter of one of the rooms overlooking the dining room on this hospital unit, and a social worker came and sat beside me. She sat beside me, and I think body language is really important, so I'm going to repeat that one more time. She came and sat beside me. She made one very simple statement and then just listened to me, and that had a drastic impact on my life. And what she said was, for you to have tried to kill yourself, you must have been in a lot of pain. That's it. And she just listened. And to be honest, I was in the midst of a depressive episode, so I probably wasn't saying a whole lot at that time, but she just listened. She just gave me her caring presence, her patience, and listened to me. Again, all she said was, for you to have tried to kill yourself, you must have been in a lot of pain. When she said that, in that moment, I felt seen. I felt understood. I certainly felt like somebody, like she cared, like there was somebody that cared. And that is what helped me reconnect to life. And the thing is, I had people in my life that loved me. I had people in my life that cared about me, but I did not feel understood. So now reflecting back 16 years later, I can now see the beauty of that statement. What she did, that was empathic listening for sure. That was reflective listening. It wasn't just a reflection, it was a complex reflection. She wasn't just saying back to me something I had said. She was saying back to me an experience I had even before I was in her presence. And I think that is why it was so impactful. So after that experience, I was just discharged from the hospital. And I think it's important to say that hospitalization, it doesn't really cure people, right? I think some of the best case scenarios, people might get their medications adjusted, maybe get a break from the life stressors, the things that they're dealing with. But for the most part, once folks are discharged, they're often going back out to the same difficulties, stressors that they were facing before, and often dealing with the same mental health conditions that they were facing before. So after I was discharged, I still struggled. I still struggled with thoughts of suicide. And there were multiple instances where I again set off with the intent to end my life. But I was able to stop myself. And I think one of the things that saved me was just the memory of that interaction with that social worker, just the memory of that person that cared, just the memory of that time I felt seen, I felt understood. And this was even years later. That memory saved my life. And I think that's so important. So if there is one skill that I think you should hone, that I think you should practice, it is of empathic listening. And you don't need to be a behavioral health professional to do that. We can all do that. And that brings me to the next topic, QPR. So question, persuade, refer. It is the 3 simple steps anyone can learn to help save a life. So QPR is a gatekeeper training. When it was designed, it was originally designed with gatekeepers in mind. The idea, if we had specific selected people in our community, so teachers, coaches, clergy, counselors trained to recognize warning signs and get people help that would save lives. In the decades of research since, what we're finding out is we don't just want selected people in our communities trained. What we're looking for is mass saturation. So essentially, the more people trained, the better chance anyone has of surviving a suicidal crisis. So with that point, it does take a community to prevent suicide. It's not something that's just should be left up to behavioral health professionals. And so if you think about QPR, think about it as analogous to CPR. So just as CPR prepares you for stepping in to assist in a cardiac crisis, QPR teaches the skills and the knowledge to intervene to prevent suicide. So CPR, we can look at that almost as a bystander intervention. So people that are trained or at least knowledgeable of CPR, they're trained to recognize warning signs. And when they see those warning signs, they immediately intervene, provide support until professional medical support arrives, right? So if I were to ask you today, and this is a bit of a rhetorical question, but if I asked you where geographically the safest place to have a heart attack is, where do you think that would be? The geographic location would actually be, based on the statistics, Seattle, Washington, because per capita, they have the highest number of people trained in CPR, which, as you can imagine, results in a higher percentage of people applying that bystander intervention. So when they recognize the warning signs, people are getting help and are therefore surviving a cardiac crisis. So again, with that idea in mind, QPR, the more people we have trained to recognize the warning signs, and not just to recognize the warning signs, but to know that those are an immediate red flags that I need to step in and I need to provide support. And then just like CPR, you apply CPR until medical professionals can provide additional care, right? The refer part is then getting connected to professional supports. Some of the key components covered in QPR, and we can do QPR typically in 60 to 90 minute training. Trainees learn the myths and facts around suicide. Again, because of the void of silence, there are many myths, many misconceptions about suicide. Trainees are learn to recognize the warning signs. They learn how to ask the question, I mean the suicide question, how to ask, are you having thoughts of suicide? Are you thinking of killing yourself? We need to be direct. We need to be explicit. We need to let the person know that of what we're talking about. And you'll learn how to offer hope, how to get help, and how to save a life. So those 3 steps: question, persuade, question the person about suicide. Again, asking them directly. For most people that experience thoughts of suicide, usually it is a secret, and very often it's a shameful secret. It's a heavy weight, a heavy burden that people carry around. So by asking the question, you give that person a huge opportunity to unleash a large amount of weight. And then persuade them to seek help, persuade them to accept your help, persuading them to stay alive. And again, I would go back to that skill of empathic listening is one of the most important skills in persuading somebody to stay alive, persuading somebody to accept our help. Letting that person know that we see them, that we understand them, that we care about them is hugely important. And then again, referring that person to appropriate resources. A little bit more background on QPR. It was created in 1995 by Dr. Paul Quinnett. He served in the U.S. Army Security Agency in the early 60s, and much of his work in suicide prevention, including the theory behind QPR, is based on his military training in surveillance, signal detection, intelligence gathering, threat assessment, and analysis of human behavior. So again, going back to that, speaking the unspeakable, the stories that need to be told, and the concept of behavior as communication, when we're dealing with things that are taboo, when we're dealing with things that are shameful to us, there's a strong likelihood that the messages we give, the warning signs we give, might be encoded, right? And there's a lot of reason for that. So I think it's important to know some of that theory comes from Dr. Quinnett's military training on encoded language. I want to go back to the beginning points. Again, how to build hope, how to build connectedness, how to build resilience. So again, hope being the expectation that one will have positive experiences or that a potentially negative situation will ultimately result in favorable affairs. So this is a quote, or it's actually more of a written piece. I wrote a few years back. I had attended a suicide prevention conference in Michigan, and attended another conference in Denver for the National American Association of Suicidology Conference. And I kept hearing this sentiment from people saying, well, if the suicide rates continue to rise, maybe we need to stop saying that suicide is preventable. And I took that to heart. I couldn't believe that those in the field of suicide prevention would be promulgating these narratives of despair, really just perpetuating these narratives of death. So I wrote this piece following those experiences that I'd like to share with you. No person on this earth is beyond hope, not one. Many times in life have I felt completely hopeless. In such times, it is imperative that you continue to hold hope for me when I cannot. Please realize that your hope may not actually diminish my pain. In fact, you're more likely to lessen my pain just by truly acknowledging that it exists. Feeling seen and understood helps me reconnect to life. No person on this earth is destined to die by suicide, including me. Your hope matters. Suicide is preventable. So again, hope is a perspective. Hope is a construct. And we need to think about not only the constructs and perspectives that we hold for ourselves, the concepts that we carry. We need to think about what concepts, what constructs are we sharing with others? What narratives are we sharing for others around us? Connectedness, and again, defined as the sense of belonging to a group, community, or family, and of being cared for, valued, and supported. Quote I want to share with you, and this is more of a paraphrase, but community is not something that is found. It is something we create one person at a time. And I think that is a misperception that we think, well, it's out there. We just need to find the right tribe. The fact is that we create the tribe. We create the culture. If we want to have an inclusive culture where people feel like they belong, where people don't feel like I felt, like I didn't deserve to be on this earth, it starts with us. We create that inclusive culture. And I think one step further, that needs to start by including ourselves, right? Think about all the judgment, the shame that we might put on ourselves when we're in distress, when we're feeling low. How would we view it if it was somebody else? What message would we give to help somebody else? We should be looking in the mirror and saying those same things back to ourselves. One of the things I often try to do, I do a couple different reflections. One of them being, I think back to that high schooler that was struggling, or I think back to that 24-year-old that attempted suicide. And I think, what advice could I give? What could I say to my younger self that could have helped? And then I also do another thought experiment where I picture myself in the future, 20 years down the road, living my dream life, living the life I would want. And I think, what would that person say to me right now? What advice would they give me to help me through this moment right now? So again, we need to start with ourselves, but we create community, we create family. And then resilience. Again, the process of successfully adapting to difficult and challenging life experiences, especially through mental, emotional, and behavioral flexibility. So a quote or a paraphrase I want to share on resilience. It's not the most intellectual of the species, nor the strongest that survives, but the one that is best able to adapt and adjust to the changing environment in which it finds itself. And this quote was from Civilizations Past and Present, was kind of a reflection to Charles Darwin in Origin of Species. I think when we read this, we can again have the mistake that this is talking about an individual level. This is talking about species, about community, about family. These strengths of being adaptable, adjustable. This is not something, an individual characteristic. This is something we do together. So again, the idea that we build resilience together in the same ways as with connectedness and hope. So as was mentioned in the introduction, I did start a suicide attempt survivor support group, which unfortunately there are very few of these across the country, across the world. And with COVID, we opened our support group up to broader participation across the state of Michigan and across really the country, and broader for those that are able to participate because we were doing it in a virtual format. Now, our group grew to the point where I had to create a wait list for people out of the state of Michigan. And I didn't feel okay with turning people away. And so earlier this year, I thought there's got to be something else that might help people. And again, going back to that concept of by sharing our stories, we can reduce somebody else's pain. We can help somebody else feel like they belong, like they're less alone. So I created Speak the Unspeakable, which is a suicide prevention video series that aims to educate, engage, and empower through the sharing of lived experience. I would encourage you to check this out later. You can access it at speaktheunspeakable.org. It is a YouTube channel, but that's the easiest way to access it. And so I want to just share a trailer with snippets of some of the videos with you right now.
Got the video's not coming through.
Sorry, I was just told that the video is not coming through. I'm going to give that one more try. I'm going to stop my share and restart. My apologies for that, everybody. What would a Zoom webinar be without technical difficulties? All right, let me try this again. If this doesn't work, if you could please give me feedback again. I think I've got the right boxes ticked. Okay, pressing play.
Research has
Looks
shown
good, Scott.
a clearly identified need that we share more stories of survival. Stories of individuals who have had firsthand experiences with suicidal thoughts or even behaviors and have continued to persist, to survive, to live, to overcome. I believe that the word survivor denotes a sense of courage, of hardship, of resilience, and of strength. So what about you? If you've survived a suicide attempt, do you celebrate the anniversary? You know that over 90% of individuals who have survived a suicide attempt do not later die by suicide, but go on to lead meaningful lives. As we begin to identify and understand the ways in which suicidal thoughts function in our lives, we can become better able to deal with those thoughts and to find alternative strategies to meet our human needs. You have an immense power to heal. It does take time, but you will cherish so many moments along the way, and it will get better. No person on this earth is destined to die by suicide, including me. Your hope matters. Suicide is preventable. The warning signs, the subtle hints, even the overt cries for help often go unacknowledged or missed and are met with silence. But we can change this. Show the person that you care. Listen with empathy. Give them your time, your patience, and your caring presence. Just as there are things we can do to improve and maintain our general health, coping, and well-being, there are also things we can do to help us through those moments of acute crisis. So if you are someone who has struggled with thoughts of suicide, or if you've survived a suicide attempt, or if you have someone in your life that you're worried about, the first thing that I would recommend is that you practice using those crisis helplines yourself, or with that other person, increasing the amount of time and distance between a person and the lethal means with which that person might attempt suicide. And it saves lives. If there is a silver lining to this, it is that I am not speaking to you from a stance of shame right now. Shame, as I had mentioned in prior videos, can be life-threatening. What I am speaking of now is guilt, and it is a pro-social guilt. Multiple studies have now demonstrated that media portraying personal experiences of overcoming suicidal thoughts by use of positive coping strategies and help-seeking behaviors can have a protective effect against suicide. Now, this protective effect has been dubbed the Papageno Effect. I believe that in many ways, shame leads to silence, and silence leads to more shame, but we can break that cycle. If you have been impacted by suicide, whether you've personally experienced thoughts of suicide, or survived a suicide attempt, if you've supported a loved one who's struggled, or if you have lost a loved one to suicide, I hope that when you hear my story, you can also feel that strength in numbers. So let us be vulnerable, let us be courageous, and let us support one another by speaking the unspeakable together.
Okay, hopefully my PowerPoint is back. My apologies for the technical difficulties. Before I come to my closing remarks, I was hoping to leave a little bit of more time for questions and answers at the end, but we will have a little bit of time. So if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A. And then I, again, just want to thank you for your time. Thank you for your energy and your focus together today. So in closing, remember that this is not the end. Our stories are not over, and our stories need to be told. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Scott, for sharing your story with our workforce. It truly does take a community to prevent suicide. Thank you very much for sharing with our team. Most people that die by suicide have indicated their desire to die before taking their life. Unfortunately, for many of us, we do not know what to say or do in those times. Because of this, the warning signs, subtle hints, or even overt cries for help may go unacknowledged and are met with silence. Hopefully, we have been able to provide some tools for you that may assist that can help change this. We often put our information throughout the year for resiliency resources, and specifically in September for Suicide Prevention Month. However, outreach isn't restricted to a month. I want to let you know you are not alone. Should you or someone you know be struggling with suicide ideologies, know that we are here. Please reach out to someone, a friend, a coworker, neighbor, community group, or church you're involved in, or even me. If you are not at a point you can talk to someone, please note that we have resources available through the Employee Assistance Program, MWR's Family Advocacy Program, Veterans Affairs, and the local community. There are many hands willing to help you. Just need you to reach out. You are worth it. Again, thank you all for your time.
Thank you. And once again, if you could take a moment and fill out the survey, there's also information if you're interested in going through the training that Scott has talked about. And we've also provided some veteran resources for you to share or use yourself. But thank you again, Scott. Very happy you were here. Great talk.
Thank you, and it was my pleasure. I don't see any questions coming through, and it is 12:57. So if there aren't questions, I just wish everybody a wonderful rest of your day.